Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors, the novelization. Chapter 8. In another reality, Neil Guinness lay in bed with his clothes on and turned off the light. This is crazy, he said aloud as he took a series of slow, deep breaths and tried to will himself to sleep. Neil pictured the old house on Elm Street in his mind, forcing the image of the abandoned house to stay uppermost in his consciousness even as he began to think about what he had seen at the hospital that day. People don't just disappear. That's what Dr. Madalena said, and for once, of course, she was right. Still, he had been there. He had seen... Well, what did he see? Maybe it had been a dream. Maybe this whole crazy thing was a dream. Maybe there was no Nancy Thompson, except in his fevered imagination. And maybe there was no Dr. Madalena and no Weston Hills Psychiatric Hospital either. For that matter, maybe there was no Neil Guinness. Neil took another deep breath and forced his mind's eye to return to the old house on Elm. A line from Shakespeare drifted through his consciousness as he surrendered to the sweet drowsiness that was finally overtaking him. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come. And then he was there. Neil stepped up onto the porch and knocked on the door. "Nancy?" He opened the door and was instantly enshrouded in a thick bluish fog. "Nancy!" he repeated cautiously. Then he stepped into the room. There was a mirror on the wall. Neil looked at his reflection and then took hold of his right cheek. Slowly he stretched it like taffy at arm's length, a grin of sheer delight on his distorted face. "I'm in," he whispered in awe as his face resumed its normal shape. "I'm in the dreamscape." Suddenly he heard a crashing noise from somewhere farther back in the house. He walked through the door at the end of the room and found himself submerged in total darkness. In another part of the house, Nancy searched for her missing comrades.
Taryn?
She called.
Kincaid? Laredo?
And then she saw him. "Missing your little friends?" he rasped, a crooked smile on his ugly face.
You son of a bitch!
She screamed, somehow knowing in that instant that Taryn was dead. Freddie laughed, raised his bladed glove, and took one menacing step forward. Nancy ducked as he swung out at her, and ran from the room as fast as she could, with Freddie always just a few steps behind. She ran through doorway after doorway down a seemingly endless maze of dimly lit corridors, before suddenly crashing into someone in the darkness.
Neil! What are you doing here?
She asked, more annoyed than relieved by his presence. Maybe she loved him, but this wasn't the world in which their love belonged. Nancy knew there were dangers here that Neil had literally never dreamed of before. "I had to come," he said, his voice trembling with excitement. "Don't you understand what this means? I've been studying the dream state from the outside for years, and now I'm actually on the inside looking in. This is going to make one hell of a paper."
You have to get out.
Said Nancy, shaking her head frantically from side to side.
You're in serious danger here.
"No, this is fantastic," said Neil, his entire body seeming to vibrate in tune to some unseen force. It's kind of like being inside some kind of incredible television,"
Stay tuned,
said Nancy.
because you're about to see something you've never seen on TV.
And then Freddie appeared twice as large as life, with his gleaming blades raised high for the kill. "Is there a doctor in the house?" he asked. Nancy grabbed Neil's hand and pulled him out of the room. "Let's get out of here," said Neil as they raced down a crooked corridor that seemed to get narrower and narrower the faster they ran.
Your dream or mine?
Asked Nancy, looking back to see Freddie gaining on them fast. She pulled Neil through the first open door she saw and almost tripped over the dismembered remains of Taryn and Joey. Nancy watched in grim silence as Neil turned away and vomited violently in the corner of the room. Laredo Laredo had lost the others around the corner of one of the countless meandering hallways they had been wandering since setting foot in this house. No matter. More than any of the others, Laredo felt at home in the world of dreams. Here at last was the ultimate manifestation of Dungeons and Dragons, with no dice or computer programs standing between the player and his wily opponent. This time the sword in Laredo's hand was a real one, forged from his own vivid imaginings. Laredo had never handled a real sword before, but he knew as soon as he grabbed the heavy hilt that this was the weapon he was born to wield. Cautiously, Laredo proceeded down a slippery staircase, ever aware that the devil can assume many forms. If his years of game playing had taught him anything, it was that underestimating your opponent's strength was the quickest route to defeat. "Rado?" Laredo whirled around, his eyes bright and his sword held high. "It's me, Rado. It's your brother Toby." The boy in the green and red striped bathing suit couldn't have been more than 7 years old. "You're not Toby," said Laredo, the sword shaking visibly in his hand. "Toby's dead." "You were supposed to keep an eye on me in the pool," said the boy. "If you hadn't answered the phone, I'd still be alive." "I was only gone for a second," said Laredo, his voice trembling almost imperceptibly. "A second was all I needed to drown." I'm sorry," whispered Laredo. How often had he wished he had never gone off to answer the telephone that terrible day. It was after Toby died that he'd begun to immerse himself in the world of fantasy. And then the dreams began. "Hold me, Rado," said the boy, extending his thin arms. "Hold me and everything will be okay." Laredo paused and took a deep breath and stepped forward. Suddenly his foot lashed out, landing squarely in the boy's crotch. Roaring with pain, Freddy Krueger lurched back and crashed into the wall behind him. "You didn't think I'd fall for the old shape-changing trick, did you?" asked Laredo, a triumphant smile on his face. "We Dream Warriors are too clever for that." Laredo paused as the implications of being a Dream Warrior slowly dawned on him. "All right," he said, mustering his concentration. "Let's try playing by your rules for a while." And then, before Freddy's eyes, the boy tossed aside his sword and metamorphosized into a fierce dragon with powerful claws and gleaming yellow eyes. Immediately, Freddy turned himself into a large black crow, flapping quickly out of reach, just as a tongue of flame shot out of the dragon's mouth, incinerating a nearby table. No sooner had the crow attacked the dragon's eyes with its sharp beak and claws than the serpent disappeared, only to be replaced by a huge red net that flung itself in the air and trapped the flapping bird. But then the bird was gone, and in its place was an oozing blob of protoplasm that quickly seeped through the close-knit mesh. And then the blob disappeared and Laredo resumed his normal form, poised for his opponent's next attack. But nothing happened. Freddy was gone. "I've won," Laredo whispered, hardly able to believe his own success. He took a deep, calming breath and closed his eyes for just a moment. But a second was all it took for Laredo's sword to fly up from the floor and pierce him through the heart. Suddenly, the floor opened up beneath his feet, and Laredo was sucked into a whirlpool of flames that instantly scorched his flesh to the bone. The floor itself laughing in triumph as the boy sank deeper and deeper into the all-consuming hellfire. And then there were 4. No one spoke for a long time as Nancy and Neil and Kristen and Kincaid faced each other in the living room of the old house on Elm Street. "Some dream warriors we turned out to be," said Kincaid at last. "We're alive, aren't we?" said Kristen.
And so is he,
said Nancy. "Whatever he is," muttered Neil, heading for the front door. Suddenly the door slammed shut and the lights went off. Somebody screamed, and then the room was illuminated by an eerie green light. Freddy Krueger stood in the middle of the room, his talon-tipped hand extended in an obscene gesture of greeting. "Welcome, my children," he croaked. "Fuck you," said Kincaid, spitting squarely into Freddy's right eye. As Freddy stepped back and wiped the thick glob of saliva from his face, Kincaid kicked him hard in the stomach and sent the startled creature crashing into the far wall.
Let's get out of here,
shouted Nancy, knowing that the four of them were not powerful enough to snatch the demon's claws. Where do we go? asked Kristen.
It's up to you,
said Nancy.
You pulled us into your dream. Now you have to pull us out.
What do I do? asked the girl as Freddy slowly staggered to his feet.
Concentrate,
said Nancy calmly.
Think of a place you know best and take us there.
Kristen looked into Nancy's eyes and nodded her head. She closed her eyes just as Freddy's claw lashed wildly through the thin air. There was a party going on at the Parker house, undeniably the social event of the year, according to the local society columnist. Anyone who is anyone will be there. Mrs. Parker was pleased. Even Jack Webster, the elusive thespian, who was rarely seen anywhere except on stage, had promised to put in a brief appearance. This was going to be the party that everyone at the country club would be talking about for a long time to come. Mrs. Parker was about to have a sharp word with an idle waiter when the telephone rang. No, Dr. Madalena, said Mrs. Parker, more than a little annoyed that the woman had dared to call in the middle of her soiree. I haven't seen Kristen. Yes, I understand there's been some trouble over there. Uh-huh. Quite frankly, Doctor, I would say that this is your problem and not mine. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have guests to attend to. She hung up the phone and returned to the living room. The waiter was now standing alone in the corner of the room, resting his tray on Mrs. Parker's favorite Chippendale chair and fingering the gilt frame on her recently acquired Monet. Or was it Manet? Mrs. Parker could never remember. In either case, it was extremely valuable, and the lazy clod was going to pay dearly for his impudence. Mrs. Parker was about to speak severely to the young man when Kristen, Nancy, Neil, and Kincaid appeared out of nowhere and crashed into the center of the crowded buffet table. Nancy scrambled to her feet and checked out her companions. Everyone seemed to be all right, except for a few minor scrapes and bruises. Kincaid had already snatched a handful of shrimp from a broken dish on the floor and was studying the house and its well-dressed occupants with admiring eyes. "Some party, yeah," he said. "Just what do you people think you're doing here?" asked Mrs. Parker, turning around just in time to see Kristen carefully stepping out of her mother's finest punch bowl. "You'll lose your license for this, young man," she said, pointing an accusing finger at Neil. "Mother," Kristen began. "I'll deal with you later, young lady," said Mrs. Parker. "Please go to your room immediately."
Too late,
said Nancy as the floor began to tremble. And then the room itself seemed to explode as Freddy erupted violently from the center of the floor with a scream of rage. Immediately, Mrs. Parker stepped forward to chastise her uninvited guest. "Just who do you think—" Before she could finish her question, however, Freddy lashed out and slashed the woman across the stomach. As Mrs. Parker looked down in horror at her exposed bowels, Freddy plunged his head into the woman's midsection and began to devour her still throbbing viscera. "Next course!" croaked Freddy, blood and guts dripping from his chin. Nancy grabbed Kristen and literally dragged her out of the room. Neil and Kincaid followed close behind.
It's just a dream,
Nancy assured the hysterical girl, although she knew perfectly well that they no longer dwelled in the world of dreams. What was done from here on in could not be undone. There would be time later for Kristen to mourn her mother as Nancy had once mourned hers. For now there were battles to be fought and powerful enemies to be vanquished. At least they had finally lured the demon onto their own turf. Nancy was beginning to wonder if that hadn't been a terrible mistake. As Nancy and her friends fled, Freddy followed close behind, slashing wildly at the frantic guest, leaving a trail of gore in his wake. Kristen had taken the lead now, steering the others around the corner and into her father's trophy room. "Holy shit!" said Kincaid. looking around in amazement as Kristen locked the door behind them. One wall of the den was lined with mounted animal heads, souvenirs of Mr. Parker's many hunting trips to the African plains. On the opposite wall was a case containing more guns than Kincaid had seen in all his years on the mean streets of the inner city. "Give me the key!" demanded Kincaid. I don't know where he keeps it," said Kristen. "Damn!" Kincaid started rummaging wildly through the metal cabinet next to the window. Meanwhile, Nancy had walked over to the glass-encased gun rack and tried the door.
"It's not locked,"
she said, swinging open the door. "Daddy must have been showing his collection to one of the guests," said Kristen. Kincaid brushed past the girl, took a vintage submachine gun out of the case, and held it lovingly in his arms. "Be careful," said Neil. "That thing might be loaded." "It probably doesn't even have a firing pin," said Kincaid. Just then, Freddy's metal claw ripped through the wooden door. Kincaid wheeled around, aimed the weapon, and squeezed the trigger. The door exploded in a blizzard of wood chips as the volley of bullets sent Freddy flying back into the hallway.
"Let's get out of here,"
said Nancy, knowing perfectly well that it was going to take more than bullets to stop Freddy Krueger. "Where are we going?" asked Kristen.
"You're the driver,"
said Nancy.
"Everyone link hands."
Neil looked annoyed. "This is no time for—"
"Tell it to him,"
said Nancy. Neil looked at the enraged creature crashing through the splintered wooden door and quickly joined the circle. "Get us out of here, Kristen." "I'm scared," said the girl. "Just concentrate," said Dr. Neil. Kristen closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Then the door caved in, and a bloody Fred Krueger clawed madly at the air, where a moment before had stood the 4 remaining Dream Warriors. Okay, Slashaholics, this has been Chapter 8 of A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors, the novelization by Jeffrey Cooper. I'm loving the fact that we're getting a totally different experience from the movie with this novelization. You don't see that a lot, even with Friday the 13th Part 3 by Michael Avallone. It was still pretty similar to the movie with a few differences, but this book is just all the way out different, and I would have loved to have seen that whole dragon scene play out between Laredo and Freddy in the movie. Oh my god, that would have been amazing. And, seeing Freddy getting blasted by a machine gun, that would have been fun too. I love that, Neil is slowly coming on board with the realization that this isn't something to fuck around with. He's still, a little bit of him I can tell is is a little bit slow to join, but I think he's getting it through his head now, especially in that last couple lines he had there. "Get us out of here, just concentrate." So I'm looking forward to the final upload. That's right, only one more upload remains of the Dream Warriors. So the next time you see me upload a chapter or 2 of this book, it will be the final one. We've got 2 chapters left, Chapter 9 and Chapter 10. Gonna knock those out in one upload, probably tomorrow. Really looking forward to it. I've really enjoyed this book. I cannot stress enough that it is so awesome to read a novelization of a movie and it be different than the movie. Most novelizations I've read have been a little bit different, but this one is just so wildly different. It's just amazing. I'm still hoping, beyond all hope, that Dr. Madalena will have a meeting with Freddy Krueger here in this novelization. That would be awesome. I'm really hoping for that. It kind of threw me for a loop that, Freddy gutted Kristen's mom and then stuck his head into the wound and started eating at the viscera. That kind of threw me, but I mean, next course! Loved it. So, yeah, guys, let me know what you thought of tonight's upload, what you think of this book being so different, and if you're looking forward to that final upload. And I'll be back very soon with the final 2 chapters of A Nightmare on Elm Street, Part 3, The Dream Warriors, by Jeffrey Cooper. Be sure to check out the Patreon, be sure to check out the merch store. Also, if you want to join up on Twitter, you can follow the channel on Twitter, you can join the Facebook group. We're also on Reddit. So just go to the description below, and you can get a link to the Facebook, the Twitter, and the Reddit. You can get a link to the merch store and to the Patreon. If you can support the channel through Patreon or the merch store, you'd be doing a big, big service to keep this channel going for years to come. Till next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, and pleasant dreams!